Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Tamara Kneese.
Thank you so much for being with us. And in fact, us means three people right now live, doesn't it?
It does. My daughter is here with us today, Leah, and she is newly 12 weeks old. So
Wow.
she may be chiming in.
And a very welcome voice too, very welcome presence. So I wonder if I could start by asking you what I query everybody about, which is to inquire what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, impeding, interesting you.
Yes. Well, I think, anyone who's ever had a newborn knows that having a new baby kind of reconfigures your sense of time. And I've been trying to find things to read or think about or organize, even mentally, that have nothing to do with our current political situation. Because if I find myself awake and trying to feed the baby at 3 in the morning, and I'm in California, so if I, start reading the news in the middle of the night, my time, usually that means that East Coast news cycle has already begun. And so I can very easily find all of the new horrors that are awaiting me to start the day. Um, and so I've really been enjoying reading fiction again. Um, and also taking some time to read things that have nothing to do with technology. So how can I enjoy my life and enjoy reading again for pleasure without having it intersect with my work in any way?
Can I then ask you about the literature that you're reading? Because the other thing, of course, is that down the line, who knows where, when, why, how, it may actually have an influence on your work, on your research, on your thinking. At least that's my experience of going back to fiction, as it were. So, what's on the shelf, virtual or otherwise?
Yeah, so I've been reading a lot of uh kind of more experimental forms of autobiography. So Lana Lynn wrote a book from the perspective of her partner. Um, and Lana Lynn was my colleague, actually. So there's a work connection. At
Ah,
NYU, we did our PhDs in the same cohort, but she is also a filmmaker and quite well-known psychoanalyst as well. And so her book is kind of playing with the Gertrude Stein kind of way of writing about oneself. Um, and so you hear about everything from the perspective of her partner. And I've really been enjoying her new book. I also have on my table ready to read Molly Crabapple's new book about the Jewish Bund and thinking about forms of Judaism that lie beyond, Zionism and the way that Jewish politics are, basically defined today. And I've been reading Eve Babbitt's as well. So I was just reading a number of her essays on life in LA at a time when things were a little bit more fun. So,
hmm, indeed. And can I ask, are you a California person originally?
no, I was born in Manhattan. My family is very New York centric, and I grew up in New Jersey. And but I've lived in a few places around the US, but I've been in California for 9 years now.
Yes, I miss it like crazy. So there are
Yes,
still,
it it's like
sorry,
a whole world unto itself, for sure.
it is in a myriad of ways, and so many horrors and so many delights, natural and otherwise. Um, bueno. So you mentioned trying not to think about work too much. So I'm afraid I'm going to sort of thrust you a wee bit into that, if that's okay.
Totally.
Huh. But you've got a free pass to say, enough, no, stop it. Of course. What I wanted to ask you about was one of the things you've written on and researched for quite a while, which is something that doesn't get enough attention at the moment unless its name is Turing, namely computing history. Can you tell us a little? I'm not asking you to give us a primer on computing history, though that would be great. But what, in your eyes, is important about that history for us to understand our present moment and future?
Yeah, so I think there's a tendency within conversations about new technology, and this is, there are a lot of reasons for this, kind of focus on the newest innovation, the kind of hype cycle. And we get that obviously from the tech press, um, and also from tech critics, because I think it can become very difficult to keep track of the latest waves of tech hype. And then you're kind of in a trap in a way where you feel like you need to respond to the latest developments and try to get ahead of them. But then you end up kind of reproducing a lot of the same points that the industry is putting out, or that the more kind of tech friendly tech press tends to put out, and basically just reiterating their you know advertising copy for them. And what I think is quite fascinating right now is to think about previous waves of tech hype. So kind of thinking beyond AI, or the thing that we call AI now, um, and even just more recent histories. So I think the other issue is that um, it can be difficult to keep track of how things have developed over the past 5 or 10 years. So in a lot of my work recently, I've been trying to look at even just the shift from, say, 2015 to 2025, when it comes to the way that the tech industry is talking about something like sustainability or diversity. And so watching the waves of trends come and go, um, and how that tends to be characterized in the moment. Whereas, when it's passed you by for a couple of years or more, you can begin to kind of see the patterns, and and a lot of the discourse that emerges in a particular moment doesn't necessarily capture what is actually happening. So I think right now what we have is a conversation about how AI is replacing people's jobs, in a lot of different kinds of categories of work, particularly within the tech industry. But I think that also ignores the mass layoffs that began before generative AI had really taken off, and before we had that particular line in place. And so, what does it mean to understand um, how differences in technology are also part of a larger story about power, about what bosses always do, about capitalism, and about things that are not really about the technology itself and how it works or functions. And then I think also what's been really fascinating is watching all of the conversations around data centers emerge in this moment. And this is something I've written about in my work. And it can be quite frustrating, because I think, for people who have been studying data infrastructures for a long time, and who know the history of computing and know the kinds of environmental ramifications that computing has had for a long time. So, there have been books written about the environmental hazards of chip manufacturing, and of, the mining of critical minerals, and all of these other aspects of computing that go beyond, the data center proper, or energy use, or things like that. Um, and this is not a new problem by any means, and yet it kind of whenever you have a hot topic trending, it tends to become completely ahistorical. And this is a tendency not only, I think, within the popular media, but also within particular academic corners. And so, if you look at some of the big computing conferences and AI focused conferences, or what have become AI focused conferences, there's a tendency to, make everything about generative AI or about agents or about whatever the latest kind of technological trend is, um, and ignore all of the previous waves of scholarship that existed before. Um, and it can be quite frustrating, I would say, as somebody who, does read a lot of history and would like it to inform at least the work that is happening now.
No, a beautiful point. And if we go back through the history of communications technologies, it was ever so. Centuries of environmental despoliation, extraordinary health risks posed to workers, and so on, from the Gutenberg Bible and the moments of so-called invention of printing, all the way through the history of the bourgeois and state media. And really, computing is just the latest iteration of what is a horror. But again and again, there is great scholarly, journalistic, and industrial value in forgetting the past. There's a wonderful poem by Bertolt Brecht where he says 80 years ago, I saw something coming over the hill and it presented itself as entirely new, but when I got closer, it was something very, very old. And around the same time, George Orwell wrote about how in the mid 40s, towards the end of the war, he was reading a number of books that were announcing the end of X because of Y, transportation or communication medium, the end of war, the end of nationalism, the beginning of mutual citizen understanding, and so on. And remember that 30 years earlier, at the beginning of the First World War, he'd read the same claims being made. Um, so, yeah, I think that ahistorical element that you refer to is incredibly important, but it's really hard to know what to do. I wrote to one of the New York Times so-called technology reporters about 6 months ago and listed maybe half a dozen or a dozen names of famous women and men writing about the history of the communications media over the last 80 years and said, I'm interested in your work and I appreciated this article you just wrote, but I'm also interested that these people and hundreds like them are not on the honors roll. And he wrote back very quickly and very politely, I've never heard of these people, period. You know, end of reaction. But one of the things you've done very successfully, it seems to me, is to write scholarly books and articles, but also to intervene at a policy and activist level. So, and you've included history in those interventions. How have you done it, and what's it like moving between these registers?
Yeah, I think it is a tricky place to be in part because you feel always a little bit like you're letting someone down or you're you're kind of walking on eggshells in a lot of ways. So I think it could be a little bit risky, particularly in this moment, to try to bring activism into one's scholarship or into one's day job in any sense. And I think that even looking at policy intervention. So, if we go back to the Biden administration, which wasn't that long ago, um, there was a lot of emphasis on green technology, investments in green technology, and there was an open door basically within the nonprofit world, within the academic world, policy world, to focus on the environment and the intersection of technology and the environment. Um, and then very quickly with the Trump administration back in power, um, all of these terms became forbidden. All of these ways of thinking about the world, writing about the world became forbidden. And the entire research apparatus essentially has been dismantled. Um, and all of a sudden, having a pretty boring, NSF grant about the environmental impacts of AI, is suddenly something that could be um, a source of not just, of negative attention, let's say. Hoping that Fox News won't find your grant with a particularly woke title and, you know, spend too much time on it. But I think that one of the interesting things has been on the other side. So, within activism, particularly tech worker focused activism, or within you know, academic work that tends to be less historically focused. Um, like I said, a lot of the computing conferences do tend to focus on the newest thing, the newest trend. What does it mean to try to get people to acknowledge computing histories or histories of activism that are completely outside of computing proper, um, in order to stop trying to reinvent the wheel? And that was something that I think became very obvious with a lot of the tech worker activism I was seeing from, say, like 2016 or 2017, the first Trump administration, um, through kind of the early days of the pandemic, when there was this sense that, there was a new tech worker movement. And oh, isn't it shocking that software engineers are organizing and forming unions? It's like, well, this is not this is not totally new. This has happened before, both within the US and outside of the US. And how do we, trace these histories and learn from them in a practical way? So I think, trying to connect the people who are doing in-depth scholarship today, but also looking at people who are doing groundbreaking ethnographic or historical work, say in the 80s or 90s. You can still read stuff from the 80s or 90s, as it turns out. You don't have to only read things that were written in the past 2 years. Um, so I'm thinking about people like Karen Hausfeld, who was engaged in a lot of ethnographic work around electronics manufacturing and immigrant women in Silicon Valley in the late 80s and early 90s, and was a fairly prominent figure at that time, and was, had articles in Wired about her research, but is not, uh, still, kind of very active publicly in a way that people can latch onto. And so, how do you take all of the work that she did back back then and make sure that, it can speak to what is happening today? Or, and Chris Carlson is somebody that I see around town a lot. So, he's best known probably for starting Critical Mass in San Francisco, but he also started Processed World, the magazine from the 90s that was, really critical of tech and all about tech worker activism in a variety of different ways. And it, in many respects, kind of mirrors the kind of cross-collar solidarity, that we saw emerge with groups like Tech Workers Coalition in the, in the kind of 2015 to 2020 era. And so what's been really fun, I think, is trying to figure out how to get previous waves of tech organizers and also historians and ethnographers from previous eras in conversation with contemporary tech worker movements and academics who maybe, are not often reading history and they're not spending time in the archives.
If they were brought up in the United States, they'll have heard of Herman Melville. They may have been forced to read him. but they may not have read his groundbreaking ethnography of women manufacturing paper in the state of Maine and the environmental impact on their bodies of doing so, and how this relates to wealthy libertine lawyers in Britain whose cast off clothes formed the basis of this, not rag picking, but rag remaking. So I would urge in these efforts to get people to say nothing that was in the past is relevant, except there's this element of technological organizing, very important. And there's always Herman Melville and Bertolt Brecht and George Orwell. We've all heard of them. How could they possibly be relevant? So, Prof, you've picked up on a couple of really important issues here that I'd love to go into in greater depth. One is this question of platform labor, as it's sometimes called. And the other is this issue of the environmental impact of artificial intelligence. Maybe we could do one and then the other, if that makes sense. Which one would you like to start with?
Oh yeah, we can start with the labor stuff.
Yeah.
Why not?
Mhm. So this is a big issue, as you said. People are being laid off, and new job descriptions are flourishing in certain domains. And there is a panic outside the world of the platform about the industrial relations, labor relations impact of these transformations. Tell us about some of the issues and also how the organizing seems to be taking shape.
Yeah, so the it's been interesting to track how different forms of labor are being impacted by generative AI in a way that is really an extension of other forms of platform labor that had been happening. And so, um, going back to the early days of the pandemic again, was an interesting moment where academics who, maybe some of them had been kind of forced to use Canvas or Blackboard or any number of other platforms for, you know, pedagogy, but at the same time, most people had not been teaching on Zoom before 2020. And the way that everyone's labor became connected to Zoom, all of the elements of having, inviting students into your personal space, realizing that they could see your cat or your child, and but also thinking about how this relates to much um, older histories of working remotely as well. And so, the historian Mar Hicks has a lot of work on the gendered nature of computing and tracking women who were doing various kinds of computing work from home with children um, around them, and the transnational history of this as well. Um, Looking at women in India, for example, Winnie Poster's work, looking at how women would often do this work from home, and become essentially virtual assistants remotely, even as they were, of course, human and not AI. And so I think one interesting aspect of the current discourse around AI and work, as it relates to platform labor and work, is that a lot of the kind of taskification that we see with things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, where you have a lot of platform labor happening in a very dispersed workforce. People are working remotely. People are working from various places all over the world and thus have, trouble connecting, which is why Sit Silberman and Lily Irani formed Cropticon initially to help Amazon Mechanical Turkers connect with each other and have more power, collectively against the requesters who, sorry, uh, were able to basically dismiss them and their work um, without any accountability. And sorry, baby's chiming in. Here we go. Um, but now we're in a place where everyone's labor, even people who are highly specialized, highly educated, and part of the white collar workforce, so lawyers, academics, programmers, um, are fully having their jobs become imagined as fully task-based. And we're essentially, we can automate all of the day-to-day stuff that we do. And if we do that and figure out which elements of our jobs can be automated, um, not only connected to platforms, but also automated, then we basically are all out of luck and out of work. And that does seem to be the current, you know, hope, at least on the part of many different kinds of employers. And, it's no secret that administrators would love nothing more than to replace tenured faculty with something cheaper and less annoying, right? Uh, and so there's a direct relationship, I think, between the shift to Zoom-based labor and remote labor in the academy, the taskification of higher ed, not to mention the whole kind of creation of the neoliberal university, going back decades before that. But there's a clear line between all of these different processes and the idea that now we'll have, generative AI somehow be able to replace faculty openly.
Is this making for divisions within higher education between technology boosters and the rest? Or are technology boosters looking over their shoulders, hearing the footsteps, gaining ground on them?
I mean, they should be worried too, because and I think it's something that people in the tech industry, including people who use AI regularly and understand how it works, the coders themselves are very worried, especially middle managers. And that has been how a lot of the layoffs in tech have been middle managers, uh, for exactly that reason. Um, and I'm not really sure within academic labor struggles if there's yet awareness on the part of those who will also be fully replaced in theory by AI. But for now, it seems more like there's a desire to appear at the edge of innovation. So I think if we look at all of the job descriptions and all of the job calls for building huge AI related centers and, cluster hires of, 100 faculty who specialize in AI, um, things like that make it clear that a lot of this is really not is really trying to capture the moment that we're in and seem relevant, I think, at a time when higher ed is generally under attack in a lot of places, including especially in the US, but also, of course, in the UK um, and other parts of Europe as well. And so I I think what's quite fascinating is that you know there might be a really fruitful moment, maybe, where people in higher ed kind of do spend more time talking to people in tech directly about what they're experiencing. Because I think that there may be some uh, some inability to fully see the picture from within academia sometimes, um, particularly because once you know how the technology actually works and you're seeing how it's remaking labor within the tech industry, um, it becomes quite clear what the end game of AI actually is, which is not what the administrators and higher ed sell it as being.
Prof, before we get on to the environmental material, could I pick up on something you've just touched on, which is, I think, one of your other themes, which is partly experiential, is social scientists within bro world. So could you talk a bit about that? Because it is interesting the way in which these monsters, sorry, these incredible innovators have been interested in part in embracing social science to tell them things.
Yeah. I mean, there's such a, incredibly fraught history, of course, of anthropologists being used by colonial governments and also the CIA, the military. And this idea that you can have people within your ranks who kind of meticulously document what they're seeing as objective observers who are outsiders in a way, and that they will be able to basically see things that you would not see as an insider. And that, when we think about the role of the futurist in the tech industry, there is a relationship between the role of the futurist um, and the role of the ethnographer. And there are some people who really kind of inhabit that space very well. So like Genevieve Bell, who was at Intel, of course, for a long time and is now at ANU. She is somebody who really followed that path of, having a PhD in anthropology from Stanford, really being an academic who focused on things like religion and the intersection of religion and technology, which then informed the way that she uh, thought about structuring social science inflected user experience work within the enterprise. Um, and so there's always been this tension, I think, where you have academics or people trained in the social sciences who then enter different kinds of fields, including technology fields and corporate fields, and more broadly, and use their knowledge and their methods that they would ordinarily apply to an academic field site and do that in a corporate environment. But there's also a tension because, as a perpetual outsider, you're not necessarily taken very seriously by people who have different backgrounds and different worldviews. And your work is often perceived as being, maybe a nice to have or something that could be a supplement to the real work that is happening with an organization. So it is not technical work, or is usually not defined as such. And so that's been a problem not just for people with a specific social science background within the corporate environment, but also anybody who does something like user experience design or user experience research. And so how do you prove the business value of the research that you're doing? Um, and that tension between, ethnography and social science work being something that takes a really long time to unfold, that is very thoughtfully planned, um, and even how it's presented. So, in forms of writing, usually things like academic articles or books. These are not the things that you will find that have a lot of direct business value within the tech company. And so, how do you translate your ethnographic findings into a PowerPoint presentation that will be compelling to C-suite, where you lay out maybe, your main takeaway on the first slide and then just like come back to it periodically to make sure that they get it. Um, it's just a very different mode of presentation. And uh, and then I think there's a question of, is providing a fuller ethnographic picture of how people use technology, it does maybe reduce some of the harms that are found within technology products. So there's a way to kind of notice and preemptively tweak products before they're released in order to do some kind of damage control. Mm, But there is a tendency also, I think, to um, inadvertently end up rubber stamping products that should not that should not exist at all. And so, is it good to make like the evil death machine slightly less evil, or less deathy? I don't know. Um, and so that's the other kind of tension I see often, is that people feel personally responsible within a corporate setting to do good work and to prevent harms as best they can, but then they also tend to not actually have any um, real power within that situation.
Well put, and I sense there may be an element of your own experience
Yeah,
informing this. And I think you're
yeah.
writing about this or have been. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, so I am working on another book that will be a little bit, and part of the reason why I've been reading a lot of kind of quirky memoirs and autobiographies is that there's an element of that here. Although I'm much more interested in the kind of role of the outsider in tech, um, in a larger sense. So, um, how are and it's very easy to be an outsider in tech too, I think. I think, um, there are many ways in which, even if you are not actually an ethnographer or trained as one, you kind of become one. And so that's why, looking to figures like Ellen Ullman, who famously wrote some of the best firsthand accounts of the tech industry in the 90s, um, you know, her observations about being a woman, especially a woman programmer in tech in San Francisco at that time. um, I think there's an element of always feeling like you were documenting something as you were living it, but you don't fully feel that you were a part of it. And I think that can also be protective in some sense when you take a job that you're ambivalent about. And so, what does it mean to um, try to hold an outsider status, even as you are, of course, also part of a larger system, no matter how hard you pretend that you're not.
Well, I want to get back to the topic of your earlier books in a moment, but prior to that, can we get to the promised discussion of the environmental impact of artificial intelligence?
Yes. So, because I was at Intel at a time when AI was really beginning to take off. I was there basically, I was at Intel when ChatGPT was launched. Um, and that was definitely a breaking point, right? Um, but in general, my research was looking at high energy workloads. And so that included things like streaming and gaming, as well as NFTs and Bitcoin mining. So thinking about how other forms of computing were impacting the environment, and particularly looking at energy use and how different kinds of developers were hoping to mitigate those impacts through things like energy efficiency, um, renewable energy, and also at that time, um, carbon offsetting through Web3, um, and all of the things that have completely disappeared from the conversation, which is quite interesting. There are still people who are trying to tokenize the rainforest, but I feel like no one really cares about blockchain right now. And we're done with that. And yet, a lot of the things that we're talking about regarding AI's environmental impacts were foreshadowed completely by Bitcoin mining. Um, and yeah. So with the environmental impacts of I have a pretty good sense of how a lot of folks from a more engineering perspective would try to quantify the impacts. And so, there's many different ways that people do that kind of carbon accounting, both at the company level and at the kind of individual developer, researcher, advocate level. Um, and part of the problem is that the numbers can really obfuscate what is actually happening. And this is why we get tech companies releasing sustainability reports that seem really positive about their water use and their energy use and their use of renewables, because they tend to focus on a very tiny part of the picture and not look at the full supply chain. They're maybe only looking at their operations and not at their downstream impacts. And this is one of the many problems with trying to rely on kind of a definitive number is the thing that will tell you if something is sustainable or not. Um, and that all of that tends to really not focus on the embodied experiences of, say, living next to a data center or living next to a mining operation, or, working in electronics manufacturing and getting cancer. Like there are many things that are not going to be uh, directly acknowledged when you focus at that kind of meta level quantification of the environmental impacts. And it can be very hard to reconcile these two worldviews. And of course it makes sense that, at a kind of industry level or company level, you're not going to have um, a lot of attention paid to the anecdotal evidence that is coming out of the communities that are dealing directly with the environmental impacts. And so you get this really strange juxtaposition where you might have a company talking about their water footprint regarding all of their technology, but they might look at AI specifically, and maybe they're focused on data center uh, water use. And that doesn't necessarily tell you about the local aspects of dealing with a neighboring data center that is taking water in a region that is already water stressed, or, the kind of more municipal level fights that are happening over access to water, or the pollution of water through, forever chemicals. And so, one of the interesting things to follow has been um, that kind of constant back and forth that I see a lot in policy conversations and activist conversations about the environmental impact of AI, but also even in the reporting itself. And so you have a lot of storytelling, you have a lot of communities kind of showing up to town hall meetings, and we kind of get the same kinds of anecdotal data again and again and again. Um, but that isn't perceived as being as objective, right, as the kind of larger metrics. And so you also have a lot of folks who are always trying to map and quantify and figure out ways of, calculating the true cost of, AI in that way. Um, and I, you know, I guess my question always is, all right, now that we've done both, we have all the stories, and we have a pretty good sense of what the problem is. We also have a pretty good handle on the general way that water use or electricity use are, we kind of see how they're going and where they're trending, and we kind of understand what the biggest problems are. But how do you actively try to fix any of that? Um, and it's the other interesting thing for me has been watching the discourse around data center moratoria, and there's a lot of anger right now towards the technology industry and AI and data centers in particular. And, it really is something that is true of communities in many different parts of the world. Um, Totally outside of, like a US Republicans versus Democrat, red state versus blue state kind of um, framework. But uh, you know, now there are also accusations that the resistance to data centers is coming from foreign influences and that it's all, basically like bots that are driving this. And there is, to be fair, a lot of AI slop that is actually also infiltrating the data center resistance kind of discourse. And you can find any number of really horrible images of, data center resistance that is actually just slop. Um, Ironically. But it, it isn't necessarily totally helpful for data centers to be the end of the story, I would say. And so um, you know, this is part of the problem too. I think connecting what AI is actually doing and the larger political project of the thing that we're currently calling AI, connecting that to the environmental harms, connecting it to the problems with, local level governance and democracy that we see playing out again and again in various places. Um, how do we kind of talk about this in a way that doesn't become like if we kind of like shut down some data centers that will fix this larger problem because unfortunately the AI infrastructure is being integrated into so many of our services, into our government agencies, um, into our curricula, into, even K through 12 education, um, into healthcare, certainly. And so you know, how do we reconcile kind of the data center discourse with the larger problem of, what AI is doing too?
Prof, one of the elements that seems to bind some of the white men running the big corporations involved in this is fear and insecurity. They're terrified of the great unwashed, and they're terrified of the future. And part of this expresses itself in the cryogenic movement of the moment and the desire for eternal life. Against that, you've written about death and technology. And I smile and laugh as I say that because it's a serious topic on its own, but it's a remarkable juxtaposition with the bro's desire to have all kinds of magical treatments to extend their lives. Could you chat a bit about those books that you've done on this really fascinating topic?
Yeah, happily. So, this fear of death and the idea of using technology to somehow thwart death and decay, the concept of mind uploading, going back to, Kate Hale's book from 1999 on how we became post-human, this feeling of being able to somehow divide the physical self from the mind and the desire to upload one's consciousness into a computer system in order to never have to deal with bodily death. But also, I think there's a desire in a lot of these fantasies about disembodiment just to avoid the flesh altogether. And so it's basically it's a way to imagine something that is better than the fragile, definitely mortal human flesh bag that we're all kind of inherently attached to. And there are religious elements, and a lot of people have written about this. John Bielecki has a really great book all about Mormon transhumanism, which I've also kind of dabbled in. Um, and so, certainly there also are Christian transhumanists as well. So there are people who have an overtly religious sense of using technology in order to radically extend the human lifespan or live forever in a way. Um, but we see it in such mainstream parts of Silicon Valley culture, and this has really been part of the Silicon Valley narrative and experience for a long time. And this is why figures like Elon Musk, kind of grab a hold of a lot of these fantasies. Same with Mark Andreessen. This idea that we're going to somehow become digital, colonize space, and avoid not only the decay of our own flesh, but also the planet that we've destroyed. Um, this is really quite the fantasy, and in all of these fantasies, there's this sense of kind of preserving individual human subjectivity as distinct from relations. So, as distinct from relationships, not only to the body, one's own body, but also others, kin members, and other, parts of context that would be helpful, and also ecological settings and such. And so, this idea that you could still be a version of you or a better version of you detached from all of your various relations is really quite odd. But I do think that, and other people have written about this as well. So Sarah Sharma has written about the kind of mommy fantasy of a lot of things that will be innovated within the tech industry in places like San Francisco. So, apps that take on the labor of doing your laundry or, getting your food for you, and this idea of outsourcing domestic labor, essentially. Um, None of those ideas are new in any way. Um, but I think there is a relationship between imagining a form of self-optimization that can lead to immortality and the kind of mundane ways that this culture plays out with things like, various apps, but now also with the fantasies of what generative AI can do when it comes to automation and also relationship building. And so I'm really interested in how people's relationships with chatbots as lovers, as companions, also intersects with the need to resurrect the dead through chatbots, which I did write about in my book. And also this idea that you can somehow build a chatbot that will be immortal, without kind of acknowledging the material limitations of the chatbot itself, including just the commercial viability um, of the companies that are creating the chatbots in the first place, but also just the basic material limitations of software. And thinking about glitches and software updates and changes in personality that are a result of um, the nature of the technology itself. And so this idea that you can somehow have a form of permanence, at the same time you're relying on a technology that is perpetually updating itself, is very odd if you think about it.
And you've edited a book about this, The New Death, and you've also written the monograph Death Glitch, which is a fabulous syntagm that I've not read these books. I work in the global south. We just don't have access really to scholarly work in English uh, in many cases. But I should let people know lots of your work is freely available to read online, including scholarship and activism and industry reports. And I'll include your terrific website in the wee notes accompanying our discussion. I wanted to ask you, as a means of bringing things to a close, speaking of Death Glitch, whether there's something you'd like to add. And that something might take the form of entirely new material we haven't chatted about, or it might be something that retraces some of the steps we've taken together.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you note the, the difference in access in the global south. And so, by the way, I can send you a PDF of my book if you want it. Um, happy to share that anytime. But you know,
Oh, sorry to interrupt.
this
The
is
little person's sort of rousing herself,
she
and
is.
she just waved in the most adorable manner. And she has gorgeous eyes. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Oh, well,
it's
thank
impossible not
you.
to respond to that little hand moving.
She is cute. I do like her. And she's named after my dead grandmother as well. Um, and yeah, part of the thing that I really hate sometimes about where I am just physically and geographically speaking, is that, the way that we talk about technology is still so dominated by the narratives that come out of US based tech and Silicon Valley, or what is called Silicon Valley. And I think there's been a lot of good work in trying to undo even the myths of Silicon Valley as a place and thinking about, okay, well, Santa Clara Valley is in fact not all about tech. And, let's talk about the history of farmland and canning and all of the other kinds of industry that are part of the narrative. But, in so I would just say that I'm always interested in reading stories of tech that have nothing to do with California or the US in general. Right, Leah? Yeah. We're sick of it. We're sick of it.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. Feeling sick of the US-centric nature of so much discourse about this, and also trying to be aware of, in a sense, the stories and the people who are so often excluded from the mainstream narrative, and how their history and many others' histories can actually teach us a lot about what's going to happen next. So I thank you so much for educating me a great deal today, and I'm sure it'll be the same for baby Leah and other listeners.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been delightful.